We have discussed in the previous chapters that improvisation as an artistic method was by no means an invention of the 20th century. But it was also more than just a rediscovery or re-evaluation, as for some musicians, the experience of improvisation led to a paradigmatic shift in their artistic practice. Improvisation became their main focus and method of music making. In this chapter, I will try to trace this development and discuss some of the preconditions. The developments we are going to discuss here evolved mostly during the three post-World War II decades, the 1950s, 60s and 70s. I'm mentioning World War II here not only as a time reference, but also as a moment of the tragic failure of human culture and a point in history that raised many fundamental questions regarding the future of the planet and the values of human life, resulting in a political, philosophical and aesthetic discourse that was by many experienced as truly existential. The world required a new and better order, and this also applied or was reflected in the arts. So far I have talked about non-European musics, Western art music and jazz. The two last mentioned traditions, together with growing awareness for music cultures of the world, the development of new technologies, and the appearance of rock and pop music, were going to become the main resources and inflows for the music of the second half of the 20th century. I've already pointed out the significance of improvisation in jazz music. Regarding the development of jazz during the post-World War II years, we can recognize one important shift: the gradual, or in some cases decisive, emancipation from the realms of commercialized entertainment towards a self-conception as a serious contemporary art form. Corresponding acceptance and change of status were most evident in Europe, where jazz music was greatly perceived as the artistic expression of a seemingly omnipresent desire for political change, individual freedom, and social tolerance. In the previous chapter on jazz music, I talked about the Chicago-based AACM, the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, a self-organized collective of musicians that started to develop a new vision of African American music that was going to build on the jazz tradition, but also incorporate other resources, such as the exploration of African musical traditions and the integration of contemporary Western art music positions and practices. I'm using the AACM here as an example and a model for a development that was in a similar way shared by many contemporary or avant-garde jazz musicians of the time. Due to the increasing racial and social tensions and the sparse performance opportunities in the US, Europe, with a growing interest in new jazz that was reflected in numerous festivals, radio programs, etc., became an attractive place for American musicians. As a result, leading figures of jazz in general and of the New Thing movement in particular were performing in Europe regularly, or even made European cities like Paris their new home base. And the influence of these musicians on the European scene, musicians and audiences alike, was going to become quite significant for the development of the European improvised musical practice, which followed. As discussed in the chapter of Western art music, we find the European contemporary music scene of the 1950s and 60s also underway, looking for new directions, both regarding aesthetics and creative procedures and the exploration of new technologies. As in the mentioned sense, all things of the past were being reconsidered, also the human factor in music was put in question. Here, the still prevailing romantic notion of the artist as the main source of creation through intellectual and affective self-expression became a rather dubious and undesirable one. To simplify the point, if human nature is capable of creating the horrors of World War II, why should it be trusted in the field of the arts? So instead of putting the affected human subject in the center of musical creation, the sound itself became the object of interest. And the sound and its new possibilities needed to be experimentally researched and at some point also organized by the instance of a sober and detached supervisor, the new kind of composer.
When I hear what we call music, it seems to me that someone is talking, and talking about his feelings or about his ideas of relationships. But when I hear traffic, the sound of traffic here on 6th Avenue, for instance, I don't have the feeling that anyone is talking. I have the feeling that sound is acting. And I love the activity of sound. What it does is it gets louder and quieter, and it gets higher and lower, and it gets longer and shorter. It does all those things which I'm completely satisfied with that. I don't need sound to talk to me.
In some cases, improvisational practices became part of this research. But as improvisation by nature seemed to contain a big portion of subjectivity, it was complicated to comprehend and in that sense more difficult to handle compared to, for example, chance operations, tape machines or synthesizers. And let us not forget that most musicians at the time did not have any or just very little experience with improvisation, and therefore a lack of competence as improvisers. As a result, for a majority of composers, the exploration of improvisational processes was a very short episode or liaison soon to be abandoned. At the same time, a new generation of musicians that was trained in the Western tradition, but also participating in the more recent developments of new music, came to discover improvisation as a truly new way to approach music making. We can recognize numerous aspects that attracted them and promoted this development. First of all, finding new sounds on the traditional instruments, a major focus of new music aesthetics, required a process of creative exploration and the decision to break traditional rules. As the individual performer's ability and competence to find and produce new sounds was paramount in the new aesthetic, the status of this new kind of virtuosi that were in fact breaking traditional boundaries and expanding instrumental standards was quite high. So, while the superior role of the composer remained unquestioned, the status of these performers was rising. Many compositions were especially written for certain individuals and their skills. One can see this also as a new kind of co-authorship between composer and performer, but also as a call for emancipation and autonomy for the performing musician. But as improvisation slowly became more acceptable for some, the figure of the composer, or at least the notion of a compositional framework, still seemed necessary for most. For some improvisers, the solution to this problem seemed quite simple. Improvisation was considered to be composition in real time, and therefore even referred to as instant composition. There are obvious advantages in this concept. It frees improvisation from the accusation of being just spontaneous and random uttering, and at the same time raises it to the status of composition, a complex structural process of aesthetic consideration. The downside, so to speak, is that the term instant composition does not promote a better understanding of improvisation. It might even do the opposite by locking us into traditional Western categories. But nevertheless, we can acknowledge a movement of musicians coming from the Western art music background that were founding ensembles that would focus and dedicate their practice on improvisation. As mentioned before, social and political ideals of equality in social life artistic collaboration and creation, freedom of expression, etc., played a role in many of these cases. At the same time, there was also a growing number of European musicians that have been identifying with the jazz tradition and its protagonists. These musicians, while in most cases also being initially trained in a traditional Western way, have studied jazz music mostly through imitation, practice and informal studies. And as the above-mentioned new conceptions of jazz, the new thing, were coming out of the African American community, these new developments were perceived both as impulses for emancipation and models for change by European musicians. As many of the European jazz musicians felt a persistent stigmatization for imitating and copying an African American art form, the new perspective to integrate elements from their own cultural traditions seemed a compelling necessity. The resulting variations and forms in which these new conceptions of European jazz were formulated reflected both individual and national preferences. And the extent to which original elements of the jazz idiom remained in the music or were eliminated, replaced or transformed varied very much from case to case. Coming out of the just mentioned new music and new jazz scenes, a new musical genre was created, the so-called improvised music. A new musical direction that had only one main principle and credo, that it is created through improvisation. Once established, this seemingly radical approach to music making quickly gained popularity and inspired professional musicians and amateurs alike to experiment with this practice and eventually join the movement. We can see many liberating aspects of this new practice. Musicians could join regardless of their musical backgrounds or preferred idioms. Even the level of instrumental skills, or the lack thereof when viewed from a traditional perspective, seemed not to be a limiting factor as long as the improvisational interactions and expressions made sense to the performers and the audiences. This opened up the possibility of musical expression to many people that did not undergo the more traditional training and education path, but also created criticism and sometimes even the accusation of dilettantism. In any case, the community of free improvisers was very heterogeneous, and one can hear in the recordings and documents of the time that the sole fact that the music was created by improvisation and without any preconceptions did not produce unified musical material nor result in a specific musical style. Since the protagonists came from very different musical backgrounds, the aesthetic question of how the music was supposed to sound would become an entirely different process, investigation, and discourse. Derek Bailey, for instance, a leading figure in the European improvised music scene and author of the already mentioned book Improvisation, Its Nature and Practice in Music, postulated the creation of a non-idiomatic music, a music that would free itself from all idiomatic and thus traditional ballast. This idea resonates with the ideals of the new music and its emphasis on finding new sounds. In contrast to such an ideal of historic unrootedness, the African-American conceptions mostly incorporated a strong notion of cultural heritage and tradition in their visions of a new avant-garde. Perhaps one could say in an oversimplified way that the first generation of European improvisers starting in the 1960s, people like Evan Parker, Alexander von Schlippenbach, Peter Brötzmann, Gunther Hampel, Mischa Mengelberg, Irene Schweitzer, was influenced by both jazz tradition and the new music tradition as departure points for the new developments. For a second generation of improvisers, most prominently represented by the so-called New York downtown scene of the 1980s, people like Fred Frith, John Zorn, Zina Parkins, Elliot Sharp, Arthur Lindsay, these traditions would not be the central reference points anymore. Their postmodern and deconstructivist approaches towards numerous musical genres and traditions with a focus on genres of popular music, created not only new sounds, but also an approachability for a new generation of listeners and followers that were more accustomed to popular music styles. The improvised music scene is today a global phenomenon and a community of very dedicated musicians that create music based on the principle of improvisation. Despite the declared principle of freedom, one should mention that the improvised music scene has occasionally developed a rigid aesthetic codex. But of course it would be quite simplistic to expect that a certain art form or genre could by definition guarantee a constant state of freedom. What it might be able to do, philosophically speaking, is to keep exploring possibilities and visions of a better world. And that is a task that is indeed inscribed in its tradition. In the next chapter, we will be looking at improvisation in music therapy and in what way it differs or resembles improvisation in artistic creation. Thank you and see you there.